speaker before we broke for Salah had mentioned the narration from Abu Bakr anhu, and in the Salah, it just came to me that the Imam, what surah did he recite in the first rak'ah? Rahman. And you remember his nation, who famously recited that in the Kaaba in the presence of all the Quraysh in the time of Prophet Sallallahu. Yes. And I could see many young guys amongst us. And that story came to my head because it wasn't the fact that it was a youth and he was reciting Quran, which it's a melodious tone, and mashallah, the brother, the Imam led us recite in a beautiful manner. It was also the meaning behind, and in the narration, the Quraysh got angry and they battered Abdullah bin Masud anhu. And the next day, or the following narration, Prophet asked, who's going to go out and recite again? And he stood up and again. And the reason why it affected the Quraysh so much is because it wasn't just the recitation, the manner it was being recited, but it was also the meaning. They understood the meaning. And it was going against, it was attacking their beliefs. For us, that we should take that as inspiration. We're having young guys, most of us are still young in here. The far right, they come with a certain narrative, but at the same time, when we come as a response, we should look at they're facing problems in their lives, they have issues in their society that they're facing. We should present Islam as a solution to them. When it comes to the social problems, when it comes to rights of women, etc., even when it comes to economy, corruption, all these things that they're facing in society, Islam has actually come with a solution. And the verses that were being recited by the Sahaba, by the Prophet, revelation was coming, was giving them solutions to their problems at the time during to the Quraysh. And it was providing an alternate solution. So perhaps we should think about that and open up a Q&A. If anyone has any questions, comments, go on.
Salam. Despite social media has blown a lot of these far right narratives out of proportion, I'll give you an alternative. In the 90s, in places like Drummond Street, murders took place. Serious knife attacks took place where racist indigenous people in this country were ducking down Bengali, Pakistani, maybe in West London. There was more attacks on the Asian and Middle Eastern community in the 90s than there is now. It's statistically proven. There was more murders that took place. In Southall, the Sikhs were killed and burnt. In here where some of the Bengali community grew up, Drummond Street was a no-go zone. It was so dangerous that people in their 40s and 50s now tell stories of getting chased with machetes and baseball bats right through here to Somers Town, running for their life. Like, I don't think my alternative narrative, what I present to brothers is that despite all the things we see on social media, the conditions of Ahl Muslimin in this country is a lot better than places like Belgium and France. For example, I have some family in France from my mother's side. They live in places like Lyon and La Chapelle and Paris. These places are way more dangerous than places like Harlesden, Stonebridge, Kilburn, Tottenham, Peckham, Brixton. Because the banlieue is completely out of the inner city. Where London, you have a big council estate, and then you have a nice private road, which is worth £3-4 million. What I'm trying to say, brother, is that do you agree that the social media narrative is blowing up proportion because the leaders of this country, it's all bil kalam, it's just words. They're not actually changing. They're not doing anything repressive or oppressive to the Muslim community through laws at the moment, right? So I just wanted to ask you, do you agree the fact that despite maybe social media is blowing it out of proportion, the conditions of the Muslimin in France is a lot worse. Halal food is rationed. Women can't wear hijab and niqab in certain places. So despite what we're seeing right now, it's nowhere near as bad as the conditions of other Muslims in other parts of Europe. And I just wanted your take on that, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. So, first thing I'll say is things never stay the same. There's no human life, society never stays in a static static state. Yeah. If you take a snapshot in any decade of any society, you see it's changed from the decade before. So things are not in a static situation. They are constantly evolving and changing and moving. So that's the first thing. Before I say, yes, relatively, I will agree with you. Relatively, Britain is, at this point, not as bad as the conditions, if you like, the negativity towards Muslims and migrants as some other European countries or some of the places in America. America is a huge, it's like a continent almost, North, USA. So not every state is the same, and not every city is the same. So there's variation there. But, and the other thing, I'll agree with you, in the times we grew up, I'm young, but in the 70s and the 80s, very rough, very violent. And we had a lot of violence committed against us. We had to take certain routes to school. We could rarely go to the park. I can count the times we went to the park as a family, probably on my one hand. It's not safe. But and in the 90s and the noughties, maybe things, my children definitely grew up in a different reality. But things are changing. And where I would probably come back on what you're saying is that things are getting worse. If 100,000, 150,000 people can march through London from around the country, which has never happened before, attacking Islam, attacking Muslims, attacking Palestine, things could reach a fever pitch. The other thing I mentioned in the talk is that if you look at the surveys and reports that are done on attitudes, these narratives, these non-Islamophobic narratives, are permeating the mainstream. So that report by, I think it was a Hope, I can't remember what it's called, they did a survey in 2019, that's 7 years ago, which said a third of Britons have bought into these narratives. 47% of conservative voters had bought into these narratives about Muslims taking over Sharia, no-go zones. So this is, if it becomes a majority of people start buying into these narratives, even though the majority might be silent, but if they start taking on these attitudes, that becomes a very hostile place for Muslims who are a minority to live. So there's a direction things are going in, and the Islamophobia has become mainstream now. It's not on the far right. The main political parties are adopting these, Conservatives and Labour. Yeah, despite them having some brown faces, you see very anti-Islamic policies. I would say that at a policy level, there are anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim policies. Many laws, not all the anti-terrorism laws, they target Muslims disproportionately. So the law is there. Maybe, definitely, as you say, it's not as bad as where some of the European countries have gone, but things are on a trend. So my issue is that we need to engage. We can't just be sleepwalking into a situation where suddenly there's a pogrom against Muslims. Anyone who studies history, that might sound far-fetched, but you've heard Baroness Warsi, she was the chairwoman of the Conservative Party. She reached a very high rank in the government in Britain. Yet she has now realized that Islamophobia is rife in the society and amongst the political class. And she says, my parents used to say, like, one day they're going to kick us out, and she never saw that. She never believed it. She worked to be integrated and integrate Muslims into the society. Now she's saying that I don't see that as an impossibility. If you study European history, it's full of pogroms, meaning mass expulsions of people, mass deportations. Many pogroms were made against the Jews. And one thing people don't realize, there are many pogroms made against Christians themselves. America was founded by Christians who were expelled or felt like they had to leave Britain. If you study the American history, those who went over on the Mayflower were religious exiles. They were the Protestants. They felt they had been persecuted in Britain. Their faith is not being... So they had pogroms against themselves. The history of Europe before this post-war period is one of a history of religious wars and intolerance against each other and other faiths. So I don't want to see it go that way. I'm not saying it's going to return. I'm saying we need to be optimistic. We need to be in it to win it. As in, I don't think it's a battle, but I think the majority of British people, they just want to, all human beings just want to live a good life, a peaceful life. This hatred has been manufactured by certain elements in the society and the elites. So if we're not engaging in that, we're going to lose it. So that's really I mean, I haven't got all the answers, but this work is trying to work out what is the way forward. There's a role for different sections of the Muslim community. Like I said, the institutions, the masajid, the centers, there's a role for them. There's a role for the du'at, the Muslim activists and thinkers. And there's also got to be a role for the masses. There is a demographic thing which is changing. There's a demographic shift. It's nothing like what these people are painting. There's no conspiracy. As I said, there was a conspiracy. I wish somebody told me about where that conspiracy being plotted, because I've never been invited to it. But Muslims are in the last census 5 years ago. Remember that 2021 census. Muslims were 6.5% of the population, almost 4 million. So that would have moved on in the last 5 years. If the projections go right, 20, 30 years, we could be 10% of the population. That's significant. That can be a significant good for the whole society. Rather than thinking about a clash, there's a place for counter narratives, but I think there's also a place for a positive narrative, an active, engaging narrative, as in creating our own story practically. How do Muslims live peacefully and as a positive impact on society? That needs thought, needs thinking, needs work. Otherwise, if we just do nothing and we just remain as individuals, things are not going to get better. Things are going to slide. So I say, like, it's not static. Going back to my point, things are not static. Things are going to slide to a worse situation unless we actually take part in positive change.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the kuffar, what you see from the mouth is far worse than in their hearts. So, isn't it a given that the elite, I differentiate between the elite and the elite have a strong hatred for Islam? It's not that there's some sort of conspiracy or some sort of diversion that they want to use the far right. They actually are. They hold those values, they hold those concepts strongly against Islam. So it's the politics that's stopping them from being openly, really Islamophobic. But you're saying that they're not really Islamophobic, they only use it as a detour or a distraction from their economic problems.
That's the challenge. Okay, so to clarify, it's a good point you're making. So to clarify, I'll say the elites are not one thing. So when we say the elites, who do we mean? So we're talking about the intellectual classes. We're talking about the business capitalist class. We're talking about the political class, and they're not one thing. And you'll find that amongst them, there are those who intellectually have a hatred or dislike for Islam and its culture, because either they perceive their culture as superior, or they feel challenged by Islamic. There could be different reasons. They feel challenged by the Islamic culture. They feel inferior, so they attack it. There's amongst the business class, there may be some people who have a hatred or misinformation about Islam, but you will find amongst the business and political class, there is an economic issue for many of them. It is not just or an ideological issue, not just raw hatred. Why I say that? Because look, if we look at history, it's the same. We look at, you pointed out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned about some people have hatred in their hearts. Those who are waging, conflicting against the Muslims. But if you look at the elites of Quraysh, they weren't all one. There were those who actually eventually became Muslim. There were those who did see it as a challenge to their power, not necessarily their faith. Because remember, the Quraysh, they believed in Allah. They might have committed adultery and shirk, but they still believed in, they weren't atheists. They believed in the religion of, they believed that the religion had roots in Ismail and Ibrahim alayhi salam. So they had elements of Islamic, if you like, pre-Islamic Islamic history. But they saw Islam as a challenge to their power and authority. Abu Sufyan, if you look at Abu Sufyan, it was at the last minute at the conquest of Makkah, he became Muslim. He realized Islam was the truth. And he didn't really get involved in some of the most kind of vile and disgusting attacks on Muslims. He never really did any of that. You remember when the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was broken, he went to Medina and he was groveling. He was groveling at everyone's door and he got rejected. Groveling at everyone, don't break the peace, don't break the peace, because it was a political thing for him. Look at Al-Walid ibn Mughira, the one who gave the most eloquent description of the Quran. Even though he was composing attacks on Islam, he was recognizing how beautiful the Quran was. Look at Abu Jahl was going in the night. Wasn't it Abu Jahl who went 3 nights in a row secretly to listen to the Quran and how beautiful and amazing it was? So even amongst those who were waging war against Islam, they recognize its beauty. So sometimes when you hear these things like these MPs saying Islam is it's an act of domination, really they're seeing the beauty in Islam. They want to attack it. They see a threat from Islam's beauty. That's why they wanted to ban Abu Bakr from praying in public. They saw people are mesmerized by the prayer. So they feel a threat to it. So implicitly they're recognizing the truth of Islam. And they're feeling an inferiority complex. And there are those who are genuinely have hatred towards Islam and Muslims. There are those. So I say they're not one, they don't have one idea. They're mixed. And it's all to be played for. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made a dua for Abu Jahl and Umar bin al-Khattab. His name is, Amr as well. Amr bin Hisham, for Allah to give victory through one of them. He didn't know, even though Abu Jahl was waging conflict, and Umar was leading physical violence against Muslims. He didn't know which one was going to, in that Meccan crucible, we didn't know who would end up as a Muslim and who would end up as a kafir. Who would know that Abu Talib would end up not dying on shahada and dying on shirk, on the way of his father, and Abu Sufyan, the head of Quraysh, becomes Muslim. So I say we are in some ways we are in a Meccan crucible. We don't know which way people will turn. Who would know that Tucker Carlson, the guy who was a far-right Christian supremacist, now is saying, no, Muslims are the scapegoat. It's actually the Zionists who made this all up. You see how people are changing. So they're not all the same. And Allah says they're not all the same. Even about the Christians, Allah says, there's the ayah in Quran, Allah says they are not all the same. The disbelievers are not all the same. Some of them will revert, and they reverted, or they became Muslim. So we don't know where things are going to play. I think it's all to play for. So, but I would agree that, I would clarify that they're not all one. And we don't know how things are going to play out. So we have to engage to see who, where people are going to stand after that engagement. If we just leave things be, I think the situation just get worse, ultimately. I don't even want to come back on that. That's what I'd say.
The comment you made in your first answer about this is actually a project for the Muslims to create their own narrative, to present their own story. It reminded me, actually, before I'll tell you what it reminded me, it kind of hits home to the point that, many Muslims think, why are you even talking about this? Maybe you should just focus on your own Islam, your Salah, don't get too political. That's what reminded me of the story of when the Muslims had to migrate, they went to Abyssinia. So it's similar to us, we weren't native to this land, if you want to say. Our parents had to migrate here. Some of us were born here. So it's similar to them, but it reminded me of the story between Najasi and Jafar ibn Abi Talib, because the king was told, look, these guys, they're troublemakers, they're going, they're not from your way of life, they're going against your religion. And the Najasi grabbed them and said, look, bring them in front of me. And there was like a back and forth engagement, as you were saying. And we're many times asked to bend or compromise our faith. So look, just follow their way, just assimilate, just become a part of them. Don't make any trouble. Don't rock the boat. But if you look at the Sahabas, how they reacted, they responded with the verses of the Quran. They explained Islam. They showed the Islamic way of life. And in the end, they used a weak point to become their advantage. At the end, the king said, never will I turn these people away. Instead, he says, if you try to come after them, I'll come after you. So what I'm trying to say is there's a lesson there for us to learn, obviously. But my question is, look, how would you respond to the people who keep saying, look, if you don't vote or if you don't become like them, the far right's going to get into power, and they're going to take over, and next thing you know, you're on the boat.
Yeah, look, this is an argument. It's not a new argument. It's a tactic which been used to actually. It's an irony. Yeah? So yeah, as I mentioned in my local masjid the last 2 weeks, and I'm sure it'll be next Friday as well. The imam heavily pushing people to vote, and he's bringing all sorts of rationalizations. Yeah, not hukm shari, to claim, say that it's really, you know, does your head in, when you listen to that, because, either you're going to bring a shari argument and say this is my opinion, and he did recognize there are other opinions that voting isn't allowed, but he was all bringing all rational arguments to say why it's a good thing to do. We must do it. And this argument's been used on the Muslims again and again, and it's really an argument to make you integrate and force you to abandon your values, because everyone knows when you go into the system changes you. You don't change the system. That's been borne out. And when have we ever seen a Muslim politician do anything for Islam or Muslims when they get into power? We have a Muslim Home Secretary who's been waging war on people protesting against the genocide. So the history has shown us that this is totally ineffective. But it's been used as a strategy to scare Muslims that if you don't vote, the BNP, it used to be the BNP when we were growing up, or the BNP will come into power. Now it's Farage, and it looks like they could come into power. They could create an alliance. So you have to vote for Greens. This is the argument. I think, going back to your point, that the Najashi was the head of Abyssinia, and he was swayed by the argument. Linking back to Brother Noor's point, that the elites are not all the same, and it's not. We don't live in a dictatorship in Britain. There's many classes. There's ruling, there's civil society. There's many structures in the society, and there's many people. We could win an argument and give a positive impression of Muslims and Islam, counter these narratives. There's many people we could win over, to take the stance of Najashi if we engage. So if we do nothing, then I think, as I was saying, I think things are just going to get perilously worse. And the issue of the majority, I said in my talk, I think we really need to think about what is the role of the majority of Muslims, if you like, and just going on life as normal, living your individual life, even if it means I'm just going to be a good Muslim and live my individual life. That's not. I don't think that's a tenable situation. There needs to be something proactive and engaging that they need to do, conscious of an awareness of how things are changing. And it needs to be something that they can do. So what activists and du'at and thinkers are going to do is going to be a lot more, right? What institutions need to do needs to be a lot more. We need to rethink the role of institutions, Muslim Islamic institutions, Muslim institutions. But it's got to be, you've got to give something that people can buy into, that they can do. And I think that's a challenge we need to think about. If you give them something that's too big, they're not going to be able to take it on board. So if we give a message that every Muslim needs to be an ambassador of Islam, needs to stand for Islam, this is something the masses of the Muslims are not going to be able to do. It's too big for them. It's too much of a challenge for them. So we need to really think about, messaging-wise, what is it that the average Muslim can do to help this situation? And it's not good enough. I mean, it's not going to work if you just be passive and do nothing, because it's going to come home to bite everyone. So I think that there's a big challenge there. I don't think the answer is also we need to, forgive me, I don't think you're making that point, but we can't, if we say we are standing for Islam, everyone needs to be involved in projecting Islam, that just feeds into the narrative. They will just say, I told you so. They want to take over Britain. All their whole thing is about Islam. Yeah, I think there's got to be something else, that's what I was alluding to. We need to create an alternative narrative. I mean, practically, we need to live in a way that people are able to perceive these people are positive for our society. And that's what Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was able to project. Ibn Ad-Dughana, he wasn't talking about Abu Bakr's Islam. He was saying, you are a credit to your society. How can you leave Mecca? How can it be the Quraysh are kicking you out? You do all these good things. You're an outstanding citizen. You help people. So that would be an ideal situation where the majority don't fall for these narratives and say, no, Muslims are good for our society. They have a positive impact on our society. Why all this hate against them? And if a third of people 6-7 years ago are saying, they're suspicious and buying into these narratives, and by 6 years' time, it probably got worse. But it still means there's 2/3 who are not in that camp are buying into those narratives, and we need to win more back to sanity, right? So I think there is a work to expose the narratives, but that's not going to be everyone. We've got to have a program or a vision for everyday Muslims to kind of take part in the solution as well. And I think that's a hard part. I haven't got all the answers to that. I think a lot of thinking needs to be put into that.
I'm gonna end the talk here because the food is here, and just want to say a few things before we wrapped up. So that we can continue discussing as we eat, and it's nice to see a lot of new faces. Inshallah, you guys return next month. It'll be the last Friday of every month. So the last Friday of next month is May. And the last thing I'll say is if I'd like to speak at how the Sahaba, when they would, in a gathering before they departed, they would recite Surah Asr to one another. Shall I ask the speaker to recite Surah Asr?
So we'll recite together. It's not really a dua, but we recite it together. Sahabas did. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر.
If you can make